Day 101. Nuclear war had devastated the west coast of America. Los Angeles and San Diego were gone, wiped off the map by multiple impacts, by either Russian or Chinese nuclear weapons. Off the coast of San Diego, an entire carrier strike group, probably the only one left in the entire Pacific, was wiped out a day ago by another nuclear strike. That's how we found out the war wasn't over. It was still going on. Our group was down to me, Alexis, Lilith, Annie, and our loyal dog companion, Lucky. In just 100 days, we'd have lost so many already, and it seemed impossible to believe that just 3 months ago, I was living a normal life in a normal modern city. Now I was trying to figure out how to rally the group's spirits. We'd seen the dangers of giving up already. That's how we lost Mr. Vasquez, shortly after the bombs fell. San Diego was not an option for us. The ruins would be still too irradiated, and besides, it suffered from the same problem as any SoCal city. No real natural resources. SoCal gets most of its water from elsewhere, but that intricate system of aqueducts and pumps largely requires electricity and maintenance to function. We had to get somewhere we could survive long-term, or at least last long enough to make a real plan. Our best option was Big Bear, a small mountain community in the mountains outside Los Angeles. It has a large lake for fresh water that's well stocked with fish, and the local mountains are teeming with wildlife. Back in the old world, it was a getaway for Angelinos. Now it was our best chance at survival. With vehicles no longer working due to bad fuel and the EMP blasts, we'd be on foot, using our bikes when we could. And it wouldn't be a short journey. Plus, we already knew of at least one dangerous cannibal community in Los Angeles outskirts, and there was no telling what else was waiting for us out here. With heavy hearts, we turned around and went back the way we came. Days 102 to 106. It was good to be on the move again. It helped get everyone's minds off the crushing disappointment of finding out the world was waging a nuclear war. During our rest breaks, Lilith took to practicing with the rifles we'd looted. After being abducted by the cannibals, she was determined to never be that vulnerable again, and thanks to me and Annie's coaching, she was becoming pretty proficient. Deep down inside, something told me she'd need those skills. At night, we'd see the occasional moving bright spot of light, which could only be a high-flying military plane. There were no more commercial airliners in the sky, and I wondered if that was only in this part of the country or everywhere. The way I figured, us and whoever we were at war with were striking each other's cities one by one in the most destructive game of one-upsmanship in history. It makes sense the West Coast got taken out first, and I was willing to bet the story was the same on the East Coast. America's most important government and financial centers were all on the coasts. The heartland was probably relatively untouched, and I imagine that the enemy, whoever they were, was slowly bombing its way inward from the coast until one side admitted defeat. We were probably doing the same to them. Day 107. We spotted him long before he saw us, a distant figure coming down the highway toward us. Through Annie's binoculars, he looked as if he might be in his late teens or early 20s. Definitely looked worse for the wear, unarmed and carrying only a backpack. Lilith immediately wanted to hide and let him pass by us, sparking a fierce debate. I can't blame her for not trusting strangers after almost being eaten alive by cannibals, but Alexis refused to let this world change us the way it did those cannibals. If civilization was going to survive, it needed good people to stand up for what was right. Besides, he was alone and unarmed. She made a convincing point. Annie and I went ahead of the group while Lucky, Alexis, and Lilith stayed behind. Lilith covered us with a rifle. She'd become a good enough shot that if this kid tried anything, I was confident she'd put him in the dirt. The kid didn't seem surprised to see us, but he was definitely a little bit apprehensive. He said his family got killed by raiders 2 months after the bombs, and he'd been walking south to San Diego, hoping that at least the military base there had survived. We broke the bad news, and his shoulders slumped. He had nowhere to go, and I couldn't just let him walk off alone. Besides, the bigger our group, the stronger we would be, so I offered he'd join us. With a big smile, he happily agreed and introduced himself as Robbie. That night at camp, I noticed Lilith was keeping a close eye on Robbie. She'd changed since her ordeal. She used to be lighter. Now she was serious most of the time. It scared me a little. Having Annie helped, and for her part, Annie barely budged from Lilith's side. Losing her brother Ben had been a huge blow, but having Lilith near really helped. I couldn't help but wonder if Lilith felt guilty considering Ben had died trying to rescue her. But I pushed those thoughts out of my mind and instead let my focus be on the positive. Lilith and Annie weren't the only ones to find love in the apocalypse, and I snuggled in to sleep next to Alexis, waiting to get woken up for my turn to take watch. Days 108 to 112. When we told Ben our plan to get to Big Bear, he agreed wholeheartedly and even suggested that we take the desert roads instead of the 5 freeway to cut down on travel time. Plus, it'd be less likely we'd run into cannibals or raiders on the move in remote roads. That was a good idea, so we left the 5 behind and headed east into the desert. Luckily, there are still desert communities out here, and gas stations popped up regular enough that we could top up on supplies as needed. Some of them had been scavenged pretty hard already, but we had plenty of supplies to make it to Big Bear even if we didn't find anything on the way. For the millionth time since the bombs fell, I found myself shaking my head. 4 months ago, my biggest concern was Diablo Immortal being a microtransaction hell. Now, I was in literal hell, and my biggest concerns were radiation poisoning, cannibals, and dehydration. Days 113 to 117. Despite relatively open roads and our bikes, we weren't making very good time. The heat during the day was oppressive, so we traveled at night, but it was still hot enough to sweat. Besides, we didn't have a bike for Robbie and had yet to find one, so we were forced to move at his pace. We were getting near the Salton Sea. I knew it because you could literally smell it. If there was anywhere in the world that resembled a nuclear apocalypse before the bombs fell, this was it. Once had been a vibrant resort community after the Colorado River flooded over irrigation canals in 1905 and poured into the Salton Basin. Humans did what humans do best and took advantage of the impromptu giant lake as a vacation spot. A sprawling resort community sprung up along the banks of the sea, and it was a popular getaway destination for decades. But soon the only water flowing into the sea was agricultural runoff, which made the sea 50% saltier than the ocean. The wildlife began to die off and massive blooms of algae poisoned the water. People left the once thriving community around the sea, letting the desert retake the land and leaving homes, hotels, and shops completely abandoned. Now the sea was so overrun with toxic algae and dead fish that it stunk for miles around. It was an ecological disaster, but I guess that didn't matter much anymore. Robbie warned us about Slab City, a rough and tumble lawless community that existed before the bombs fell on east banks of the Salton Sea. He said he'd heard rumors that it had become a focus for bandits and raiders, and he was sure the group that killed his family had come from there. We decided to set double watch while we slept, just in case. Day 118. I woke up to a rifle in my face. On the other end of it was Robbie. Please, you don't understand. Don't make me shoot you. I should have listened to Lilith. That's what you get for trying to be good in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. He'd subdued Lilith and Annie already and chased Lucky out of the camp. I was surprised I'd slept through what must have been a brief struggle. Both girls were handcuffed and gagged and glaring daggers at him. But Lilith's knuckles were bruised. Robbie's right eye was rapidly swelling and turning purple. There was also a bite on his arm from Lucky. Well, there was nothing I could do. He had the drop on me. I could only cooperate and try to find an opportunity later. Doing something now would mean he'd shoot me and then probably shoot Alexis next as she lay sleeping next to me. He tossed me handcuffs for myself and Alexis. And once we were gagged as well, he rounded up all our group's weapons. Then from his backpack he pulled out a flare gun and fired it into the air. A minute later there was a response from flares somewhere in the desert. Robbie stayed quiet as he waited for whoever was coming, avoiding our gazes. We'd been kind to him when we could have left him to fend for himself on the road, except, of course, he wasn't really by himself. He'd been an infiltrator sent to gain our trust and disarm us, probably to steer us in the direction of the Salton Sea. But he didn't look happy about the situation. The one time he looked at me and we locked eyes, he apologized again, shaking his head and repeating what he'd said earlier. "I'm so sorry, you just don't understand." I could swear he was on the verge of tears. But then we heard them, the sound of people approaching, a group of about 8, all of them armed and looking surprisingly well. I guess I expected bandits or raiders or cannibals or whoever these people were to be dirty and disheveled. But this group looked clean and healthy. For a moment I hoped that this was a different group possibly coming to our rescue. Those hopes were dashed when the apparent leader stepped forward, a giant of a man with a wide smile on his sunburned face. He clapped Robbie on the shoulder hard enough to nearly topple him over. "Good job, boy. It just brought you and your sister a few more weeks of life." He had a cruel smile as he looked over us. "All of you look healthy. Good. We won't have to eat any of you. You're my property now. I'm Billy. Remember that name. You're coming with us and you're gonna work. And if you don't, you die. Simple as that." They dragged us onto our feet and prodded us forward and into the desert, heading east. Day 119. Billy had proclaimed himself feudal lord over a large swath of what was once the most productive farmland in the country, just on the southern end of the Salton Sea. This area had grown everything from oranges to avocados, all fed by the mighty Colorado River. The system of canals that fed the water all the way here to California had apparently been damaged somewhat, and farmable land had shrunk, but there was still a surprising amount of rich farmland here, and Billy controlled all of it. a slabber, as residents of Slab City used to call themselves. He left the big city life and headed out for the anonymity of living in the desert, outside of the law. When the bombs fell, he saw his opportunity and he took it. Now, the farmers who used to work this land still did, alongside their families, along with large groups of wanderers and other survivors, all of them slaves. And we were the newest additions. The rules were explained to us on the way. If you didn't work, you got shot. If you talked back, you got shot. If you tried to run away, well, it was the middle of the desert, and outside this patch of oasis, there was nowhere to go. They still didn't come to look for you, but the desert would probably kill you before they found out. And if it didn't, you got shot. The women and men were split up at night, but worked together during the day. Billy explained that if we behaved ourselves, he'd eventually let us live together with our family or friends during the off hours. It was a reward for good behavior. But no matter which way he painted it, it was clear. We were slaves and his property. We now existed only to keep the farms alive and producing food. It all made sense now. These guys were living well off this rich farmland and their slave labor force. Without a doubt, most of them were living better than before the bombs fell, back when they were just slabbers out in the desert. Most of them had criminal records, so the transition to killing and slavery had been an easy one. I fought down the growing pit in my stomach as they dragged Alexis away to join the rest of the girls. If anything happened to her, I'd kill everyone here, starting with Billy. Hell, I was already planning on it. I just had to find a way to get free first. Days 120 to 127. A surprising variety of crops grow here, and the prevailing winds meant that the radioactive fallout largely avoided settling along this stretch of desert. This made the fertile soil here possibly some of the most valuable real estate left in America, and it was run by a bunch of thugs. We worked from sunup to sundown. I'll give Billy's crew this much: they weren't outright cruel, but they punished you harshly if they thought you were being lazy. And of course, there was the ever-present threat of being shot for breaking any of their rules. I got to see Alexis, Annie, and Lilith during the workday, and it hurt my heart to only have a few brief moments with them before we were forced to return to our duties. While the men and women both worked the fields, they were segregated, so the women worked one side of the fields and the men in the other. I guess this was to keep the former families and friends from colluding, but all it did was fill me with a terrible rage. I can't believe how quickly humanity had fallen. There were about 70 slaves kept here, and Billy and his crew numbered at just over 20, so the odds were roughly 3 to 1 in our favor, except they had all the guns. I'd have to find a way to fix that somehow. Day 128 to 132. Got to see the girls briefly today. Annie had a few bruises. Apparently she stood up to a guard that was beating on one of the older women. She grinned wickedly though and proudly showed off her bruised knuckles. She'd obviously gotten her licks in too. I warned her to keep her temper under control. I didn't want anyone dying. I got to meet one of the other women as well. Her name was Ruslana. She was a Ukraine war veteran, had fought on the front lines against the Russians. When she was wounded, her family here in the US bought her a plane ticket to come live here. From what I hear, they practically had to drag her away from the war. Now she walked with a limp, the only real reason she'd been forced to leave. But one look in her eyes told me she was not done fighting. She told me she'd fought bullies before and she was going to do it again, but refused to elaborate further, simply saying in her broken English, "When time comes, you will know." She had steel in her eyes, and I later found out her name means lion. I believe it. The work was hard, the heat unbearable, but we had no choice but to keep toiling away until Ruslana's mystery plan went into action. Day 133. A group of us younger, more fit men got woken up early on day 133 and told to grab a few changes of clothing and be ready to march. I learned that we were going out to the old aqueduct system to conduct repairs. We'd be gone for several days, and that worried me. What if something happened to Alexis while I was gone? I got to see her before we left, and she looked worried, but I told her watch out for herself and the girls and I'd be fine. I even got to give her a quick kiss when no one was looking. On our way out, I caught sight of Ruslana grinning quietly, her eyes flitting between each of the guards assigned to this special detail. There were 12 of us escorted by 5 guards, and I knew instantly what she was thinking. 5 less guards at the main camp. I knew Ruslana was going to make her move, whatever it was she was planning. I just prayed Alexis would stay safe. Annie and Lilith too. If Ruslana was planning an uprising, those two were guaranteed to be part of it. Day 134 through 137. It took us 3 days on foot to reach one of the damaged aqueducts that provided the crucial water the sprawling farms needed. Then it took 3 days to carry out general repairs, which largely consisted of moving huge slabs of concrete and rock after breaking them up with sledgehammers. One of the guys on our crew had been a civil engineer, and he led the effort to conduct the rudimentary repairs, but he warned they wouldn't hold for longer than a few years at best. That was good enough for our guards, who just shrugged their shoulders. There was no way to know what was going on back at camp. Without cell or satellite phones, there was no communication this far out. I barely slept at night, knowing Ruslana was up to something dangerous. On the first day of repairs, I did spot a familiar yellow figure in the distance. I squinted my eyes, and to my surprise, it was Lucky. I can't believe I'd almost forgotten all about him. I was so stressed out since our capture that I completely forgot about our trusty canine companion. He'd fled shortly after biting Robbie when Annie yelled at him to get away, and now here he was, tailing us. But he wasn't coming near. It was like he had his own plan and was waiting to make a move. Days 138 through 144. Our guards grudgingly admitted we were in no shape to march back after 5 days of hard work and gave us 1 day off. Then on day 144, we started the march back to camp. I kept spotting Lucky in the distance and knew he was still trailing us. I didn't know what was going on back at camp, but I knew that Ruslana must have made her move by now. With 5 guards away, this was the best opportunity she'd have, and I couldn't let us get back into radio range so our guards could check in. If they found out the camp was overrun, they might just shoot us all, or try to use us as hostages to subdue everyone again. I couldn't let either happen. I got close with one of the other captives, Rob. Like me, Rob was a veteran, and in hushed conversations I told him what Ruslana had been planning, and what she'd likely done by now. He agreed we couldn't get into radio range. We came up with a plan. I'd love to say it was a good one, but it really wasn't. That night we agreed that I would say I had to do a number 2 and take one of the guards with me. Like we used to do when traveling, the guards slept in shifts. Typically 3 slept at a time while 2 watched over us. That would leave only 1 guard awake. I didn't know exactly what he was planning, but he told me it was critical I neutralize my guard. I was eager to. The only shame was that Billy wasn't here. Ruslana had probably gotten him by now. I said I had to use the bathroom, and with a disgusted grunt, one of the guards nodded at the desert as he stood up and grabbed his rifle. I scanned him real quick and was relieved to see he wasn't carrying a sidearm of any kind, just a knife down by his boot. Good, though. I'd have to beat him to that knife. I egged him on to go further out than usual, telling him I had the Hershey squirts and this was going to be a real mess. None of us wanted it close to the camp. Reluctantly, my guard agreed, and we went out about 100 meters from the camp. Then I dropped my pants and squatted. Predictably, he turned his back to me, not wanting to see me paint the desert floor in chocolate tones. I made my move. It's surprising how quickly old military training comes back to you. I'd spent years outside the wire on deployments in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Often, I had to spend the night outside the wire too. I knew how to move quietly. I must not have been quiet enough though, because he turned around just a second before I was ready to make my move. I'd been planning on silently choking him out from behind, but plan B would have to suffice. With all my strength, I delivered a right jab straight into his solar plexus, knocking the wind out of him. Then before he could recover, I sent an uppercut with my left hand that clicked his teeth together. When he hit the floor, he was out like a light. As if on cue, there was a series of gunshots back at the camp. I ran as fast as I could, grabbing my guard's rifle and flicking the safety off. There were 2 guards face down on the ground, and I spotted Rob and a 3rd guard firing at each other simultaneously. Rob's aim was true, and he put one square between the guard's eyes, but the guard's sloppy shooting was still good enough to hit Rob as well. He went down clutching his chest. The 4th guard loomed over Rob and raised his rifle when I yelled and raised my own, getting his attention. Then I gently squeezed the trigger, and nothing happened. The old rusted slabber rifle had jammed. With a mean grin, the remaining guard turned his rifle toward me and raised the iron sights to his eye. I exhaled, and then a blur of yellow fur smashed into the guard. With a ferocious snarl, Lucky attacked the man, knocking him down to the ground, biting him and ripping at his arm and forcing him to drop the rifle. As I ran up, he was reaching for his sidearm, but I got there first. My rifle was jammed, but there's more than one way to kill with a rifle. I turned mine around, and as I'd been taught to do years ago, I introduced the guard's head to my solid wood buttstock. It was over in 2 hits. Day 145. Rob had been Air Force pararescue in the old world, so he knew enough about medicine to know he wasn't going to make it. The wayward shot had hit him far left in his lung, but it was accurate enough to leave him with a sucking chest wound and lungs slowly filling with fluid. There was nothing we could do for him. He asked that we leave him a pistol with 1 round and make it back to camp safely. I thanked him for what he did, and he shook it off in his typical way. With a heavy heart, we set out. Day 145 to 146. We moved a lot faster on the way back, motivated by the thought of our friends and family either being free or all dead. If Ruslana hadn't put a plan into action, or if somehow the plan had failed, me and the other guys vowed to free them somehow. There were 4 rifles and a few handguns between us. We were hardly an army, but I'd studied and fought against insurgents for years. I knew how to fight superior numbers if it came down to it. Day 147. To my surprise, Ruslana's plan had gone off nearly without a hitch. The girls had used their charms to seduce the guards in small numbers to their quarters and then subdued them. Starved of any real female attention after the end of the world, it worked like a charm. And before the rest of Billy's crew figured out what was going on, the girls had amassed enough firearms to equip a dozen experienced shooters. The violence had been brief and overwhelmingly in Ruslana's favor. 3 of the workers had been killed along with 4 of the guards. The rest were now prisoners. I was overjoyed to see Alexis safe and sound and threw my arms around her the moment I saw her. Annie and Lilith hugged me too, but I didn't hold them nearly as long as I held on to Alexis. The fear of losing her had been crippling. Lucky got plenty of hugs and kisses, especially when I told the girls how he'd saved me at the last moment. For his part, he gave plenty of wet, sloppy kisses right back. Days 148 to 155. There was the question of what to do now that Billy and his crew had been overthrown. Plenty of the captives wanted to kill the lot of them, but Ruslana wasn't having any of it. Back home, she'd fought against lawless thugs invading her country, and she wasn't about to become one herself. For various murders, kidnappings, and other crimes, Billy and his crew would live out their days in a makeshift prison. Tough, but fair, I suppose. I couldn't shake the feeling it was a mistake to lock Billy up. I would have probably put a bullet in him. Many of the former captives wanted to stay and make a home here. I couldn't blame them. The land was good, they'd have fresh water coming in via aqueducts for at least a few years more. But after a quick discussion, our group decided unanimously we'd be moving on. This place was an oasis for sure, but that was exactly what made it so dangerous. If Billy and his crew had noticed, so would others. I felt like we'd be safer. Alexis would be safer at Big Bear. Nice and remote, high up in the mountains. I even offered Ruslana to join us, but she refused. She was going to stay and teach these people how to protect themselves, make sure they were never slaves again. There was the question of Robbie. Robbie had been the one to lure us this way, and he'd been the one to disarm us and ensure our capture. To my great surprise, Lilith spoke up in his defense. Billy had been keeping Robbie's sister captive, threatening to kill her if the innocent-looking Robbie didn't lure in travelers to add to Billy's slaves. What would you have done if Alexis's life was on the line? Grudgingly, I admitted that it'd be unfair to punish him. But there was a problem. The rest of the former captives didn't trust him. Nobody wanted him here. Alexis said, "Fine, we'll take him and his sister with us." My jaw about hit the floor, but Alexis had a steely look in her eyes. She wasn't backing down from this one. Reluctantly, the rest of us agreed. It was either that or die alone in the desert. Poor kid had few, if any, real survival skills, and his sister wasn't much better. After a week of rest, we said goodbye to Ruslana, and I once again offered that she join us. I understood why her name meant lion. It was well-deserved, and I felt safer if she came with us. But once again, she turned us down. She did promise, though, that one day when these people could take care of themselves, maybe she'd see us up in the mountains. Then she clasped me on the shoulder in a soldier's farewell. Days 155 to 159. We traveled north out of the southern Salton Sea area, sticking to the west side of the sea. Since we knew Slab City was on the east bank, there was no telling what other groups from the former lawless, unofficial city were still around. I imagined some of them might try to make a move on Billy's former territory, but they'd be sorry to run into Ruslana and her crew of Amazons if they did. I got to know Robbie better as we traveled, not because I wanted to, but because Alexis was making it a point to engage him in conversation. The rest of us may understand why he did what he did, but we weren't too happy about being betrayed like that. To my surprise, though, Lilith was warming up to him, and I was relieved. After her abduction by cannibals, both me and Annie noticed she was becoming colder, more distant. I was worried we'd lose her forever after this ordeal, but the opposite seemed to be true. The former high school and college cheerleader wasn't as warm and bubbly as before the bombs fell, but she was making her way back to her real self. Robbie's sister was named Megan, or just Meg for short. She had asthma and was a bit sickly. Robbie had gotten used to taking care of her their whole life, and I guess I understood now why Billy's threats drove him to betray people like he did. Robbie would do anything for his sister, and I admired that in a way. None of us had any family left in this new world, and it would crush me to lose any of my friends. We were family now, the 4 of us, and of course Lucky, my fluffy guardian angel. Maybe in time Robbie and Meg too. Days 160 to 163. We didn't see the nuke go off. It was too far away, but we knew another bomb had struck thanks to the clouds. After a massive nuclear explosion, the type that kills cities, the clouds get blown outward for hundreds of miles as massively powerful wind gusts blow outwards from the epicenter. Far off in the distance toward the eastern skyline, we could see the edge of the telltale concentric ring of clouds, the pattern of a nuclear detonation powerful enough to wipe out a major metropolitan city. Judging from the direction, it was probably Las Vegas. The next 2 nights, we saw bright streaks of light in the sky over our heads, rising ever higher until they disappeared into space. Our retaliation. One of our cities for 2 of yours. Then they'd hit 2 of our cities, and maybe we'd try to de-escalate by only hitting 2 of theirs, but how many cities were left to even hit anymore? Somewhere out there, far to the east, America was still alive and kicking, fighting World War III. Days 164 to 168. We traveled alongside the 10 freeway toward Banning, and then north up to San Bernardino. We didn't really want to travel anywhere near a freeway, where more raiders and bandits might be looking to prey on people, but we really had no choice. None of our paper maps showed any good routes to Big Bear aside from Highway 18, and to hop on there, we'd have to get to San Bernardino. Until we were well outside of the Sultan Basin, I insisted we travel only at night, which really slowed us down. Water was starting to become an issue, but luckily on the horizon I could see the urban sprawl that originated out of Los Angeles and spread south like a massive amoeba. That meant there'd be shops where we could refill our supplies. Days 169 to 172. It was still hazardous to walk through the ruins thanks to all the dust that laid everywhere. While most of the radioactivity had died down, some of the longer-lived elements would make the soil and dust poisonous for decades. We used t-shirts wet with water to breathe through the dustiest areas, but it wasn't a perfect solution, and Lucky refused to let us wrap one around his muzzle. In the end, we were all breathing in dangerous fallout, and would have to live with the fact that our lives would be shortened by several years at minimum. This was the new reality. Day 173. We came across another group today, and both of us immediately reached for our weapons. We'd been resupplying in an abandoned big box store when we sort of just ran into each other. The situation was real tense for a minute, as both groups sized each other up. Then I lowered my weapon slightly and said we were just passing through. There was enough supplies here for both groups, and they were welcome to them. The leader of their group, the older, grizzled man, seemed reluctant, but the woman, I'm assuming was his wife, egged him on. Then he lowered his rifle. She gave us a huge, warm smile, and for a moment my heart hurt. Kindness, so rare in this new world. But then I put my guard back up. I'd been fooled once before, and I couldn't help but glance at Robbie bitterly as I thought it. Couldn't afford to be fooled again, and put the girls in danger. The woman asked us where we were going, and Annie gave her a vague answer about heading up north somewhere. Alexis asked her where they were headed, and she seemed about to answer until she got a look from her husband. Somewhere east, she said. Then she looked at Alexis sadly, and I understood why. She saw a kindred spirit in Alexis, 2 women who both wear their hearts on their sleeves even after the world's gone to hell around them. It hurt me to see that look, knowing what me, Robbie, Annie, and Lilith had done to survive up to this point and what we'd do again if it called for it. Then the groups bid each other goodbye and good luck and parted ways. We'd set back out on the road with full packs, and I vowed to protect Alexis, not just to keep her safe, but keep her from becoming like the rest of us. Days 174 to 176. It took us 2 days to make it to the foothills of San Gabriel Mountains, and I knew we were in for a hell of a climb. When people think about LA, they think beaches, sunshine, and surfing, but less than an hour from the city is an entire mountain range rising up to over 10,000 feet, and Big Bear Lake was 6,000 of those feet up into the mountains. There was nothing to do but grit our teeth and start the long, winding path up Highway 18, hoping that safety and sanctuary lay at the top of our long climb. Days 177 to 182. Winter was starting, and at sea level you'd hardly notice in the rest of SoCal, but up here in the mountains, winter is very much a thing. The temperature dropped dramatically as we climbed higher and higher, forcing us to put on warmer clothing. We even got some light snow, and soon there'd be much more on the way. There's ski resorts in these mountains, and Big Bear can get several feet of snow in the winter. But the snow that fell was just wrong, grayish and clumpy, leaving behind ashy slicks as it melted. Billions upon billions of tons of debris had been vaporized in the ongoing war and choked the atmosphere all over the earth. Now when you looked up, even in the clearest of days, there was a distinct gray smoggy haze between you and the sun. I know that Cold War reports on nuclear winter had been found to be overblown, but I couldn't help but wonder how bad things were going to get if more cities went up in plumes of fiery ash. Modern estimates said the temperature could drop by 10 degrees, which doesn't sound like much, but would kill off a lot of crops. Humanity wouldn't go extinct, but most would die. Day 183. A cougar attacked us today. It came at night, like a bolt out of the blue. Its target was Annie. She'd excused herself to leave the fire we made and use the bathroom, and then it struck. There was a roar and a scream, and the rest of us were on our feet in a second. Lucky was the first one there, and despite the big cat outweighing him by 100 pounds, he threw himself at it regardless, forcing it to release its hold on Annie. He got several good bites in, and the cat swiped him across the face, but Lucky stayed in the fight, keeping the beast off Annie. To my surprise, timid Robbie beat the rest of us to the scene of the attack, and didn't hesitate to throw himself at the cat. He was armed with only a knife, but with a ferocious scream he jumped on the cat and began stabbing it wildly. He'd gone so crazy he almost slashed us with a knife when we tried to pull him off the corpse. Luckily, Annie was wearing extra layers, and aside from a few cuts and bruises, the cat hadn't done much damage. Despite her protests, Alexis wrapped Annie up in a blanket and gave her a big hug before tending to her wounds, doting over her like the mother hen she was. I don't like what Robbie had done to us and the other travelers, but in his situation, what would I do to keep Alexis safe? Either way, that night he proved he was one of us. Robbie and Meg were now officially part of the family. Days 184 to 188. Lucky had earned himself some nasty cuts across his face, narrowly missing his eyes. Alexis tended to him as she did to the rest of us, and surprisingly he sat absolutely still for her, even when she used rubbing alcohol to clean his wounds. To his credit, Lucky was a bona fide hero twice over, and now looked the part with 3 badass scars across his face. Now he looked like a proper post-apocalypse guard dog. But that didn't stop him from showering us with kisses and asking for belly rubs at every rest break. Annie had warmed up to Robbie considerably as well, and I could see a big sister-type relationship blossoming between her and Meg. Meg was acting a bit tough too. I guess Annie was rubbing off on her. She required more rest breaks than the rest of us, and her asthma was always an issue, but you could tell she was really trying not to be a burden. I couldn't stop thinking about that cougar attack though. Normally, the big cats avoid humans and only attack when you stray too near their cubs. This one had taken the risk of attacking a human right outside a camp full of them. It must have been desperate. Did that mean prey like deer was gone from the mountains? What kind of condition was Big Bear in? Was I just leading everyone to their doom? Days 189 to 191. Progress was painfully slow. The climb was taking a toll on everyone, and the road was winding, adding extra miles to our journey. Plus, Meg's asthma was really giving her trouble, thanks to the increasing cold and physical exertion. We found a wooded copse with a small creek near the road and decided we'd take a day or two rest. We've been going for weeks now. Everyone deserved a break, and it would give Meg a chance to better acclimate. It was cold and uncomfortable, and I was really looking forward to taking over one of the many empty vacation rentals up in Big Bear and cuddling up into a real bed for the first time in months. But despite that, I found myself really enjoying our 2-day break. The creek ran cold, and we used our survival life straws to drink from it. And we had plenty of food we'd brought to last us months if need be. Granted, most of it was canned or MREs, and I was really looking forward to fresh-caught fish, but it was nice to just relax for a change. I took one of the bikes and scouted a bit, but the road up was too steep to pedal far. By my estimate, we were days from Big Bear at this rate. Days 192 to 196. One of the bags tore open thanks to poor stitching dumping supplies all over the road. That was tough because we didn't have anywhere else to store them. We made as much room as we could in the rest of our bags, but we were forced to leave the rest behind. I insisted on hurling what we left behind into the woods though. I didn't want to leave fresh evidence of our passing, though that was getting harder to do as the snow began to fall harder, and actually stick around this time. We were now in half an inch of grayish, sickly looking snow, and I wondered what effect this poisoned snowfall would have on the lake and the fish population. If the lake water was tainted, we had ways to filter it, but if the fish died off, well, that'd be a real problem for us. Days 196 to 199. We were seeing signs for Holiday Inn, Sleepy Forest resorts, and other vacation rentals or hotels more and more frequently, and we knew we were getting close. It seemed to fill Meg with renewed vigor. I hardly noticed her asthma bothering her as we made the final climb up to Big Bear. There would be almost definitely people here already. Big Bear was a small town after all, and there was little evidence it had been hit by a nuke. There was little reason to even expend a nuke on it in the first place. There might even be other survivors who made their way up here, but Big Bear was a lake and there were plenty of vacation homes that would be empty. I guess I was hoping anyone up here would be far more hospitable than Billy and his crew. Seeing as other than losing electricity, civilization should have remained relatively intact up here. But I really didn't know what we were wandering to, and it made me nervous. Day 200. It started with a low whine and then a steady thumping sound. We hadn't heard anything like it in months. So it took until it was nearly on top of us to realize it was a helicopter. Well, not a helicopter, but close. It was an Osprey, a tilt-rotor aircraft used by the US military to move troops around and conduct reconnaissance. I couldn't believe my eyes as the big, beautiful machine flew barely 500 feet over our heads. We all jumped and shouted, waving our arms. The pilot saw us, or at least I thought he did, because I thought he wagged his wing to signal he'd seen us. But then the whine of the engines changed tone and I felt a lump in my throat. He wasn't wagging his wing. He was fighting to retain control. The pitch of the engine whine changed dramatically, and then the Osprey lurched to one side as the engine lost thrust. The big aircraft clipped a tree with its sagging wing, and the entire body spun wildly before falling out of the air with a thunderous crash half a mile away from us. Ready for more post-apocalyptic action? Watch how this all started with "I Survived 100 Days of Nuclear War," or click this other video instead.